Hello my lovelies, I hope you're all well. Today's video is a bit of a heavy topic, so if you don't feel like watching this, I understand, and I'll see you in the next video. But today we're watching the justified execution of the female guards of Bergen-Belsen. So, this might get heavy. Grab yourself something to drink. I've just finished a cup of tea, so I won't be drinking with you today. But let's watch this then, shall we? So here's a fun fact for you. My maternal grandfather was actually at Belsen when they liberated. He was at the liberation of Belsen concentration camp, and he refused to talk about it for good reason. He was actually a medic in the British Army during the Second World War, and my paternal grandfather was in the RAF. He's the reason I joined the RAF, actually. He was a driver in the RAF. But anyway, yeah, so well done to my maternal granddad for being part of the liberation. So let's get into this video then.
Following the Second World War, a number of trials were held to bring the perpetrators of war crimes committed during the conflict to justice.
Trials.
The most high-profile trials took place in Nuremberg, with the remaining members of Hitler's inner circle facing the judges. The Nuremberg trials resulted in the death sentences of some of Hitler's remaining government, but a number of other war crimes trials took place. These were focused on bringing the perpetrators of evil crimes at specific camps to justice, for example the Belsen trials. These aimed to bring the SS guards and staff involved in committing evil at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp to face up to their crimes. The liberation of Belsen was caught on camera, as was the immense suffering, depravity and evil inflicted by the guards. However, what shocked many was the fact that many of the guards and staff were young women who had been brainwashed to commit horrific crimes, and many stood accused of murdering many inmates. Today we look at the justified execution of the female guards of Bergen-Belsen. Remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Bergen-Belsen was a camp that began as a camp for Allied prisoners of war. It was established in 1940 and was found within Germany, and until 1943 was used exclusively for prisoners of war. However, the SS then took over a part of the camp and turned it eventually into a concentration camp. It was made up of a number of different centres, and it had three main sections.
It's so difficult to comprehend the things that happened at these camps and the mass execution that happened, and how people could do that, you know, because these people were just ordinary people. They weren't like, it wasn't like hundreds of thousands of psychopaths that the Nazis rounded up to work for them. These were just ordinary people that succumbed to the propaganda and thought that they were doing the right thing. It's crazy, isn't it, how that kind of thing, like mass psychosis or something.
The prisoner of war one, the resident camp, and also the prisoner camp. Over the course of the Second World War, the complex held Jews, political prisoners, and other groups that were targeted for persecution by the Nazis.
Yeah, that's the other thing. It's a lot of people only look at the deaths of the Jews, but there were an awful lot of other people that were targeted as well as the Jews, like the gypsies, for example, and disabled people. Any undesirables that were undesirable to the Nazis, that is.
The SS divided Belsen into subsections for different groups. For example, the Hungarian camp, the Special Camp for Polish Jews, and the Star Camp for Dutch Jews. Between 1943 and 1944, thousands of prisoners were transported to Belsen. Whilst here, the inmates were forced to do work inside of the Shoe Commando, in which they recovered pieces of leather from shoes for recycling. Bergen-Belsen also transitioned to become a recovery camp as well, where sick prisoners would arrive from different places and they were then taken in. The idea was that they were supposed to recover at Belsen. However, the majority of them were put to work and ended up dying of disease, starvation and poor medical care. In August 1944, a new element at Belsen was established, a women's camp. This caused a large number of women to be brought over, but most only stayed for a short amount of time, before they were then moved to other places for slave labour. It's famously known as a place where Margot and Anne Frank were transported to, and where both of them died inside the barbed wire fences of Belsen.
Have you read the diary?
However, much of the issues inside of the camp were caused by the huge overcrowding element that occurred as the Germans lost territory during World War II. By late 1944, Josef Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, was in charge, and his leadership saw Belsen swell hugely in its size. Around 85,000 people were transported to Bergen-Belsen, and within a year the number of prisoners had risen tenfold, and this caused catastrophic effects. The overcrowding led to a number of issues, in particular with a lack of food and malnutrition, as there was nowhere near enough food to go around, which caused thousands to starve. Also, disease ran riot around Belsen, with huge outbreaks of tuberculosis, typhoid and dysentery, causing more deaths. Belsen itself was only meant to house 10,000 prisoners, but the huge number of transported prisoners caused severe problems, and because of this, scores of people were killed. It has been estimated that during the time it operated, over 120,000 prisoners passed through Belsen. The treatment of those inside varied on individual sections of the camp that they found themselves inside of. Exchange prisoners, for example, were often treated better than others. There were no gas chambers at Belsen, but the vast majority of prisoners died from the conditions inside, caused by the huge overcrowding. When the British and Canadians liberated Belsen, the huge scale of the problem was brought to the world's knowledge. On the 11th of April 1945, Himmler had agreed to hand over the camp without a fight, and the SS guards ordered prisoners to bury some of the dead to attempt to hide some of the crimes. A few days later, the British set up a neutral zone that was established surrounding Belsen. What surprised the British was that so many of the guards and staff, including Josef Kramer, were still inside of Belsen, and Kramer claimed that they were there to uphold order inside. When the British and Canadians arrived and entered Bergen-Belsen, what they saw was truly horrific. They found over 13,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 prisoners who were in a terrible state, many who were in fact dying of starvation and disease. The majority of the prisoners had simply been abandoned and left, and had been given no food and water for days, and 500 were dying a day from disease. The scenes were reported on the BBC. It was said, "Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads across the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies had been born here, tiny things that could not live. A mother driven mad screamed at the British sentry to give her milk for her child, and thrust the tiny mite into his arms, then ran off crying terribly. He opened the bundle and found the baby that had been dead for days. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." The British began to provide care and support for the prisoners, but after the liberation, revenge killings did take place, and even the SS guards shot and killed some prisoners who were trying to get food from the storehouses. Prisoners over the next few days were deloused, and survivors were moved to a different camp. The British forced many of the SS staff based at the camp to bury the bodies in mass graves for those who had died. The camp was then burned to the ground by flame-thrown tanks due to the epidemic of typhus, and huge efforts were made to help the survivors. But one thing remained on the minds of those with regards to Belsen. Who on earth could carry out the atrocities committed at the camp, and who on earth could inflict such suffering onto other people? Over the time it was operating, almost 500 people worked at Belsen. However, from September the 17th, 1945 to November the 17th, 45 SS guards and former workers were brought to justice in the Belsen trials, and what shocked many people around the world was the fact that many of these were young women whose names have gone down in history with the immense cruelty and sadism of the Holocaust. The trial took 54 court days and comprised of much of the British Army footage taken as Belsen was liberated. On trial were those who were found at the camp, and those such as Josef Kramer who were involved in the leadership of the camp. Other staff such as doctors and cooks also found themselves on trial. Some of the women who were brought to trial have gone down in infamy for their notoriously sadistic treatment of prisoners throughout their time at Belsen and also other concentration camps such as Ravensbrück and Auschwitz. Those women who were on trial in the Belsen trial were Irma Grade, Elisabeth Falkenrath, Johanna Bormann, Hertha Bofer, Hertha Ehlert, Ilse Forster, Irene Haschek, Gertrude Sauer, Anna Hempel, Gertrude Feist, Frieda Walter, Hilda Lisiewicz, and other women who were acquitted. However, some of these women were notoriously evil. Irma Graves became known as the Beautiful Beast or the Hyena of Auschwitz. She was only 22 when she faced the court and was the youngest person to die under British law in the 20th century. She was a strange character, as her father even threw her out of his home. Such was his disgust that she became a concentration camp guard. She became a guard at different camps and was known for taking part in selections at Auschwitz, picking those women and children to be sent to their deaths in the gas chambers, virtually playing God with other people's lives. She was also known for murdering prisoners.
You want to test somebody's character? Give them some power. Then you'll know what they're really like.
Too, with her own hands and weapons, and was even noted for setting dogs onto prisoners, encouraging them to rip the prisoners to bits. Elisabeth Falkenrath too was just a young girl when she faced the judges. She too worked as an overseer inside of Auschwitz, and she was noted for selecting prisoners to go to the gas chambers. Falkenrath was well thought of inside of the Auschwitz's command, and she oversaw all of the camp sections for female prisoners, virtually being the head of the women's prison there. She was also known for being a prolific murderer, often beating prisoners unconscious with a truncheon. She even once pushed an elderly prisoner down some stairs to her death, and she was known for shooting prisoners at will. Johanna Bormann was also known as a woman with the dogs. She was older than Grazer and Falkenrath, and worked in a number of different camps. She was selected to work inside of Auschwitz, and she abused prisoners terribly. She was known for also setting her dogs onto prisoners, for murdering them as well, and she also took part in selections. These three women in particular were sentenced to death alongside a number of men following the Belsen trials, found guilty of crimes against humanity, inflicting such suffering onto prisoners of Bergen-Belsen and also Auschwitz and other camps they worked inside of. Hertha Ehlert, Ilse Forster, Hertha Bofer, Irene Haschek, Gertrude Sauer, Anna Hempel, Gertrude Feist, Frieda Walter, and Hilda Lisiewicz were all sentenced to various different prison sentences, having been found guilty of only one offence, with the condemned being found guilty of more than one. The executions of the Belsen trials were to be carried out on the 13th of December 1945, and they were performed by hanging, with the executioner being Albert Pierpoint. Pierpoint was an experienced executioner who used the long drop method, in which he would meet prior to the execution with the condemned to work out their height, weight and also the drop needed to snap their necks. Pierpoint was brought to Hamlin Prison.
Calculate it correctly, it could actually rip the head off, I believe, on the long drop.
To carry out the executions, and he was seen as reliable and trusted, and he was expected to complete the job effectively and efficiently. When he met Irma Grazer, he wrote in his biography that, "At last we finished noting the details of the men, and O'Neill ordered bring out Irma Graze. She walked out of her cell and came towards us laughing. She seemed as bonny a girl as anyone could ever meet. She asked O'Neill questions, but when we asked her age, she paused and smiled. I found that we were both smiling with her, as if we realised the conventional embarrassment of a woman revealing her age. Eventually she said 21, which we knew to be correct. O'Neill asked her to step on the scales. Schnell, she said, the German for quick. In Britain, prison warders and medical staff would have been responsible for weighing and measuring the condemned prior to the execution, but on this occasion Albert Pierpoint and O'Neill did it. Irma was 5 feet 5 and a quarter inches tall and weighed 150 pounds, and she was given a drop of 7 feet 4 inches. Grazer's execution was also described by Pierpoint. It was chosen that she would be the first of the condemned to die, due to her age, but there is some debate as to whether her and Falkenrath were executed first. The executions of the women took place at 9:34am, 10:04am and 10:38am. Pierpoint wrote of Grace's execution, "The following morning we climbed the stairs to the cells where the condemned were waiting. A German officer at the door leading to the corridor flung the door open, and we filed past a row of faces and into the execution chamber. The officers stood at attention. Brigadier Patton Walsh stood with his wristwatch raised. He gave me the signal, and a sigh of released breath was audible in the chamber. I walked into the corridor. Irma Grazer, I called. The German guards quickly closed all of the grills on all 12 of the inspection holes and opened one door. Irma Grazer stepped out. The cell was far too small for me to go inside of, and I had to pinion her in the corridor. Follow me, I said in English, and O'Neill repeated the order in German. At 9:34am, she walked into the execution chamber, gazed for a moment at the officials standing round it, then walked on in the centre of the trap, where I had made a chalk mark. She stood on the mark very firmly, and as I placed the white cap over her head, she said in her voice, "Schnell." The drop crashed down, and the doctor followed me into the pit and pronounced her dead. After 20 minutes, the body was taken down and placed in a coffin, ready for burial. Elizabeth Falkenrath, following her death sentence, continued to deny her involvement in the Holocaust, and she stated that she did not know where the prisoners were going, that she selected to be sent to their deaths.
She would,
She claimed to have never heard of the gas chambers, but it was Pierpoint who would hear her final words. At around 10:04am, in the same manner as Grazer, she was brought from her cell, her identity confirmed, and then she was handed over to Pierpoint for her execution. With ruthless efficiency and success, he performed her execution, with the drop snapping her neck. She was only 26 when she was executed, and when she first conducted her horrific crimes, she was even younger. Johanna Bormann is the outlier of the 3 women executed following the Belsen trials. She was much older than Grazer and Falkenrath, but 2 displayed sadistic tendencies shown by the staff that worked inside of the concentration camps. When he met her, Pierpoint stated that she limped down the corridor looking old and haggard. She was 52, standing only a little over 5 feet. She was trembling as she was put on the scale. In German she said, "I have my feelings." Like the 2 women who went before her, Bormann was executed with efficiency by Pierpoint, as he had already meticulously calculated her drop needed to have been 8 feet 8 inches. Her execution was performed at 10:38, with her execution being performed very swiftly, and she was the final female executed following the Belsen trials. The men were then fetched from their cells to face their sentence and Pierpoint, and he performed 11 executions on the 13th of December 1943 inside Hamlin Prison on the gallows. The execution of the female guards of Belsen showed the world how evil in
faced, aren't they? I mean, it's no wonder given what they've seen and done, but maybe it's because they say that if you're a kind, sweet person, that sort of shines out of you. And these are obviously very disgusting, horrible individuals. So maybe that's what we're seeing when we look at them. I don't know.
Particular these 3 women were. The Belsen trials brought to the world's attention how terrible humans can be to each other, with the suffering of those inside the camp being shown in front of the world's media. The suffering of those who were responsible for the horrific conditions at Belsen was short-lived, and was no match for what they inflicted onto innocent people. Belsen was the place where Anne Frank and dozens of thousands of other people died because of the regime that sought to exterminate so many people off the face of the earth. The executions of Irma Grazer, Elizabeth Falkenrath and Johanna Bormann were justified, but for so much suffering there was only a few executed. Much interest fell on those who were simply sentenced to time in prison, and there was much debate as to whether more people could have been sentenced to death for the crimes of Bergen-Belsen. Once again, thanks for watching.
Wow. I mean, anything to do with the Holocaust is harrowing, to say the least. And that was a very interesting video. Shout out to the Untold Past channel. If you want to check some more of those stuff out, I will link to the video in the description box anyway, as I always do if I can. But yeah, very interesting video. Horrible individuals. And you know, it's funny because my husband's actually reading a book at the moment that Jordan Peterson recommends that everybody reads, so I probably will read it too. It's called Ordinary Men. I can't remember the author off the top of my head, but basically it's talking about how ordinary people became capable of the despicable, horrendous crimes that were committed during the Second World War. And these were just ordinary people, and you know, through propaganda, dehumanization of the Jews and the other people that were targeted, the people that were working for the Nazis no longer saw them as human, which was how they were able to commit such horrible acts. And there's no doubt in my mind that there were indeed psychopaths amongst the upper echelons of the Nazi Party. I think that is pretty obvious. But yeah, a darker topic today, but I think it's necessary sometimes to relive the past so that we don't repeat it. You know, you have to remember the sins of the past so that they're not repeated. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that video as much as you could anyway, it being a darker topic, and I'll see you very soon.